So we're now going to take a very quick tour of the impairments that ADHD is producing. And then at the end of that, I will talk specifically about recommendations that we often convey to adults and their families on how one might try to address these difficulties. I can't guarantee that you'll be able to address all of them, but here are the things, at least in the States anyway, that people are implementing in order to help adults with ADHD. By the way, I should have showed you this earlier. These are my sources of income, so you can see if I have any conflict of interest. I have a ton of conflicts, so I'm conflicted with everybody at this point, but I do work for all the pharmaceutical companies in the US and Canada. Okay, the prevalence of adult ADHD very quickly is about 4.5%. 3.5% worldwide. It's actually more common in developed than undeveloped countries, but that has to do with survival rates of children. And we see ADHD varying across age, sex, social class, and so on, so it's not spread evenly across the population. But by adulthood, the normal 3-to-1 ratio seen in children of boys to girls has begun to become much closer, suggesting that there may be something about female ADHD that's a little bit later to manifest itself, or at least to begin to produce impairments than we see in male ADHD. Eventually, by adulthood, they are equally severe. And by the way, our studies of women with ADHD show that there are very few differences between men and women with ADHD that are not due to the normal differences between men and women in general. So any differences we find across all of our control groups, not just specific to the ADHD group. There's very little that is specific to ADHD in women. And I say that because there are books on the subject in the trade literature that have made claims to the contrary, but which are not based on any scientific studies. Female ADHD is not a qualitatively different disorder from male ADHD, but it does have, as we will see, some differences in impairments that are likely to be due to the ADHD, and that has to do with role divisions in society. Now, we do know that only 1 in 10 adults with ADHD in the U.S. is currently diagnosed and treated, whereas it's 6 in 10 children are diagnosed and treated. So we've done a much better job with public mental health in the child psychiatry area, whereas only recently, as all of you know, has adult ADHD actually even been put on the radar screen of adult public mental health. And still there are many adult psychiatrists and psychologists who still do not understand that adult ADHD is in fact a valid disorder that needs to be diagnosed and treated. Now, over the next hour, I'm going to show you a variety of impairments as they stack up in adult ADHD, and we're going to look at each of these specifically, and then we're going to talk about how best that these might be managed. I don't know why that middle one hasn't come in yet. There it is. It was in order to be salacious, that's why. Nevertheless, notice what's happening here. As the child moves on to become the adolescent, to become the adult, there is this piling on of deficits that we see. And that's simply because the more domains in which you have access to, the more likely you are to become impaired in that domain. 5-year-olds don't drive, so driving can't be an impairment for them. But it can be once you get to, at least in the U.S., 16 years of age. Now, I'm going to be sharing with you the results of my own research, specifically a very large study, one of the largest ever done to date, on adults with ADHD. This was published last year in my textbook on adult ADHD that you see here. Kevin Murphy was my colleague on this study, and it took us 7 years to do this study because this is a very thorough, in fact, it is the most thorough evaluation of impairments related to adult ADHD ever published. We looked at 146 adults diagnosed in our clinic with ADHD. Most importantly, we compared them to a psychiatric control group. It's easy to compare adults with ADHD to normal adults and get massive differences. But what we want to know is what's specific to ADHD. What is it that ADHD does that other disorders that we see in outpatient clinics, anxiety disorders, depression, relationship problems, personality disorders, drug use problems, what is ADHD doing that's specific, that's not necessarily seen in those other disorders? So this was a groundbreaking study because it's one of the few studies that has a control group with other disorders. And for the sake of science, that becomes extraordinarily important. So here's our control group. These were adults who came to the same adult outpatient psychiatry clinic at our medical school. This was an ADHD adult clinic, and these people came because they thought they were ADHD, but they weren't. Turns out that they had other disorders, and you can see that the vast majority of them had anxiety or mood disorders. Doesn't mean those two can't go together, by the way. Many adults with ADHD have them. It means that we found ADHD not to be present in the lives of these individuals. Their problems were entirely accounted for simply by the other disorder. Now, when we interviewed these patients, and from here on out you will see 3 bars on every graph. You will see the adults with ADHD. That'll always be the first bar. You will see the clinical control group and then the general population control group of adult volunteers in our study. And what you see here is that both of our clinical groups were quite impaired, as they should be. I mean, after all, they're being referred for assistance. There better be some problem in life, work, home, relationships, school, whatever, because no impairment, no disorder. In case you're wondering, where does ADHD begin and a sparkling personality leave off? It's where impairment begins, and impairment isn't a major life activity. Now, I want you to notice something here. Although there's a couple of areas where these two groups are close, in most of these areas, adult ADHD is a more impairing disorder. Now, this is based on self-report. We also interviewed them and others who knew them well about their childhood years, and the differences become even more startling here, because you can see that even as children, these people are self-reporting much greater impairment across these various life activities than is the case for other psychiatric disorders. What you're going to see is the same pattern in every slide, which is going to allow us to conclude that ADHD is one of the most impairing adult outpatient disorders seen in mental health clinics today. More impairing than anxiety disorders, depression, relationship problems, and other difficulties for which people seek outpatient treatment. Not as impairing in inpatient disorders, such as bipolar disorder, psychosis, schizophrenia, and so on, or even adult autism. Those are very severe disorders, but certainly more impairing than the traditional outpatient disorders that most people, in primary care in particular, would feel comfortable managing. We looked at the educational histories of these individuals. In fact, we even got their transcripts through high school, and those who attempted college, we got their college transcripts with their permission. And although I can't go over every little tidbit that we found in the histories of these individuals, you can read my book on adult ADHD for all of those findings. You can see here what we found. Education was the most impaired domain if you had ADHD. And although ADHD is going to interfere with other major life activities, this is the big one. And there's a good reason for that if you just hark back to this morning's lecture. Education, more than any other aspect of life, requires deferred gratification. And deferred gratification is what ADHD can destroy. So no surprise, it would be the area of life that most taxes delay of gratification, that people with ADHD would find themselves to be the most impaired. And you can see here that it was a substantial percentage of patients had experienced these various outcomes. We found that 1/3 of our adults with ADHD never finished high school, which is 3 times the U.S. average of failing to complete compulsory education. So that alone is a very telling statistic, because the cost to a community if an adolescent doesn't complete high school is $375,000 to $500,000 U.S. That is what the community will lose in extra wages, extra taxes paid, extra value to the community, and increased dependence on social and other services that are provided by the community. I dare say the cost would be higher up here because you provide more services than we do. Now, when we look at the school as well as the work domain specifically, and we interviewed our adults, right, we found that in the work and school environments, the inattentive executive deficits were far more impairing in those domains than was the impulsive and the hyperactive deficits. We did find, however, that the emotional impulsiveness, however, was quite specific in predicting how many jobs you would be fired from in your life. So that your executive deficits are determining how poorly you might be doing your job, but your emotional impulsiveness is going to predict whether you get fired. So the two symptom dimensions of ADHD have somewhat different correlates over time and predict different risks and outcomes. But mainly in school and in work, it's the executive deficits, as you see here, that are resulting in a number of complaints that our adults with ADHD voice to us about how they were suffering in the workplace, and especially the impulsive decision-making. Now, there were additional concerns as well, difficulties following directions, frequently changing jobs out of boredom, usually with no other job to go to. They just up and quit, right? I just didn't feel like working today, so I told my boss to shove it, and now I'm home, all right? Now what do I do? Okay, it's very, very common to see this inability to bridge this. Okay, I don't like this job, but maybe I should have another one lined up before I finally tell my boss what I think of him. Several studies, my own included now, but especially the New York longitudinal studies, are showing a massive drift to self-employment by age 30 and up. Now, this could be explained by two possible reasons, and they're not mutually exclusive. It could be an adverse outcome. Individuals with ADHD find it difficult to sustain employment when they work for other people. So what's left? They self-select into self-employment. On the other hand, it may be that self-employment is a positive niche because you can be your own boss, you can set your own schedule, you can work during your peak levels of attention and arousal. We know that adult ADHD delays the normal diurnal rhythm by about 3 to 4 hours. So adults with ADHD are more likely to report afternoon and night times as their most productive time. Whereas normal individuals, that is the general population, I use the word normal loosely, but the general population usually finds that the morning to early afternoon hours are their peak hours of activation. So whatever the reason may be, self-employment may allow a flexibility, a forgiveness, a latitude that is not provided when you work for other people and you have to adhere to their demands, their schedule, their hours, and so on. And also, let's not forget that in self-employment, the consequences are very near. And as we explained in the last lecture, the closer the consequences are, the better you do. If you're self-employed and you don't work, you don't eat. If you work for other people, you can slack off a little bit and still get that check at the end of the week. So there may be something about the way consequences occur in these forms of employment that may be beneficial to the adult with ADHD. We just don't know, but certainly we are beginning to see a rise in the area of self-employed activity in about a third of our adults with ADHD. And of course, we've mentioned the problems with organization and self-discipline and, pardon me, emotional impulsiveness. But now research in Europe and here has begun to put specific consequences or costs on adult ADHD in the workplace. For instance, in Mannheim, Germany at the university, a study was just done that shows that if you have adult ADHD, you are less likely to be productive in the workplace about 22 days a year more than other people. You can put a cost on that. That actually produces a detrimental effect on the workplace and your employer. Our adults with ADHD were interviewed about problems they might be having in the workplace, and you can see what we found here. Adults with ADHD complain much more across most of these areas of workplace difficulties than did adults in either of our control groups. Particularly, look at the one about quitting a job out of boredom. I just don't care for this job anymore, it's not very interesting, I'm out the door. 2 to 2.5 times more likelihood of changing jobs. And changing more jobs, that was a percentage, not a frequency measure. The frequency measure is even greater. And so if we start to put costs on this, you will see here that there's at least a 4 to 5% reduction or more in overall productivity, 2 times the rate of sick leave, 2 times the rate of accidental injuries in the workplace. And the cost to the employer per year is going to be about $4,000 to $5,000 US of decreased productivity in the workplace. You add that up, that gets to be a lot of money. That is billions of dollars. So no surprise, we are now seeing in the U.S. that large employers are beginning to take adult ADHD more seriously in trying to identify it, and some of them are trying to get help for these employees. Others are simply trying to identify what the risks are. You may not be aware of it, but the U.S. Army screened everybody who enlisted for the first 6 months of 2008 for adult ADHD. The reason? Because they believe that it has a negative effect on technical school training. And they need to know that. And they need to know whether shifting these people into different occupational areas, known as MOs, in the military would be better and less costly. Technical training is a very, very expensive part of military enlistment for the Army, and they are now looking at the impact of adult ADHD on this aspect of training. This is all simply to indicate that big employers are beginning to see the writing on the wall and start to take adult ADHD more seriously. So the two areas that we found to be most impaired in our adults were school, followed by work. So the two areas that we found to be most impaired in our adults were school, followed by work. The third domain was interpersonal. And you can see here the kinds of complaints we got in interviewing our adults with ADHD. And notice that these adults are aware that this may be happening in their relationships, but find it very difficult to inhibit this behavior anyway. So that they may be very sincere when they say, I really will try harder, I'll try not to say things off the cuff, I'll try not to say offensive things, and then find that they do it anyway, because of the inhibitory deficit that you see here. And as we've talked about problems with verbal eloquence, if you will, with getting to the point, with being able to explain things, the inability to regulate emotion. By the way, the most impairing deficit out of all of these, in terms of its social impact, is the emotion one. People forgive distractibility. They forgive verbiage. They will forgive impulsive decision-making. They will not forgive anger. And so we found the single best predictor, both in our children and our adults, of friendship problems, marital difficulties, and dating problems was the emotional aspect of the disorder, not the cognitive or executive aspect of the disorder. So something to keep in mind, because we, I think, undervalue the importance of emotion in ADHD, as I taught yesterday. It's a very important piece of the ADHD puzzle, because it brings with it its own impairments and its own risks, independent of the working memory and executive problems. And you can see here the difficulties with following through on promises and commitments. I was interviewing a young man once, and he said, I can't tell you how many dates I have lost because of my inability to deal with time. I would make a date to meet a young woman in front of the movie theater at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. And this was someone I was really interested in, and she seemed to reciprocate that interest, and it looked like this might go somewhere. And then I forgot when 8 o'clock was. And on Friday night at 8 o'clock, this woman is standing alone in front of a theater, waiting for someone who promised her a date. People don't forgive that. It doesn't matter what you say happened. And you can say, I have ADHD, I lost track of time, I didn't build in the time it would take me to get across town, I wasn't thinking about the weather or the traffic or the density or the fact that parking was going to be a problem because other people are coming to this megaplex. Doesn't matter what your excuses are, the date's over. It is very unlikely you would be given a second chance. People interpret this lack of timeliness as a moral failing or as a lack of interest in the other person. And it's very hard for them to forgive that kind of social slight. So you can begin to see the kind of things that are affecting the social quality, the social life of these individuals. I probably don't need to tell you these things. Other things we heard from our adults, as you see here, was the talking too much, too loudly, and not listening to other people's side of the conversation. The spouses we interviewed, the married partners of our adults with ADHD, often said that they felt unappreciated, unlistened to, that the conversations tended to be one way, largely the adult ADHD to someone else, and not a lot of reciprocity and turn-taking and sharing. And this, too, can contribute to relationship dissatisfaction. So just something to pay attention to here. This is one that most adults with ADHD don't seem to appreciate, but those of us who deal with them certainly do. And that is the social stickiness, the inability to take social cues and to terminate the interaction when it's most appropriate. This is that perseverative behavior we talked about. You may find a conversation with somebody very interesting, and you may continue it on, but the person is giving you a lot of not so subtle cues that we need to wrap this up and I need to get on with this. But instead, the conversation just continues. And I've had adults follow me out of conference rooms all the way into the parking lot, not realizing I got to get to my plane, you know. It's all very innocent enough, but it can add to the social difficulties of individuals with this disorder. So you can see some of the things that we've already talked about here. Now, one of the things that our group was one of the first to discover, probably because we're all perverts, but we looked at sexual activity in our children growing up, and then again in these clinic-referred adults as well. And we found exactly the same pattern. They mapped onto each other beautifully. There is no increase in sexual deviance among people with ADHD, not as teenagers growing up and certainly not as adults. What there was this striking pattern of risk-taking, seen in having sexual encounters earlier than other people did, about a year earlier, starting their sexual lives, their sexual intercourse. We found that they were far less likely to employ contraception because they tended to have impulsive encounters with other people. Even if they were in a committed relationship, they were 5 times more likely to have had affairs outside the relationship on impulse than other people were likely to do. If you have more encounters sexually and you don't use contraception, well, the result is babies. And so there was a 9 to 10-fold increase in having had a teen pregnancy or having initiated one as the father or had one as the mother. 38% of our boys had had a baby before 19 years of age and 68% of our girls. So we were among the first, and it's now been documented in 3 other studies, that having ADHD results in starting your family nearly 8 years earlier than the general population, sometimes 10. Most people wait until their late 20s to early 30s these days to begin having children. People with ADHD tend to have their children quite young, and their children with ADHD go on to grow up and have their children quite young. So we have shown in our longitudinal studies this is a cross-generational effect. Starting to have children when you may not be necessarily ready to have children or to be able to support them in the way that you would like to do so. By the way, teen pregnancies are very costly to society. They are some of the highest risk pregnancies of all pregnancies. And so it's no surprise that there is a huge economic impact of these adolescent pregnancies. So we have now found that the single best predictor of who's going to have a teen pregnancy is ADHD. So my friend Eric Mash at Calgary has now gone into homes for unwed mothers and screened all of these teenage pregnant girls and is finding a nearly 8-fold increase in the prevalence of ADHD in these homes. It's probably even higher than that because he's using self-report, and self-reports of ADHD are not reliable until you're about 30 years of age. Most of our follow-up studies have found that people growing up with ADHD have a very limited awareness of their ADHD and often have a positive bias about their lives and their functioning that doesn't really resolve itself until they get into their 3rd or 4th decade of life, when they start to agree with other people about how serious their impairments actually are. But prior to that time, most of the kids we followed into adulthood in their late teens and 20s did not see themselves as having a disorder or symptoms of a problem. It wasn't until they hit their late 20s to early 30s that they began to wake up and smell the coffee and realize that much of what was happening in their life was the result of this disorder that could no longer be denied. And we still see this even in adults after 30, this somewhat positive, illusory bias about how well versus how poorly they're functioning in certain areas of life. So for this reason, don't be surprised if when you see a clinician, they will want to interview someone who knows you well. And that is to make sure that we are detecting the degree of the disorder accurately, whether it's interviewing parents, siblings, friends, partners, spouses, or just looking for the paper trail of impairment in your life. It needs to be corroborated. And we teach that now as part of our teaching clinicians about assessing adults with ADHD. You always corroborate their reports, because the tendency isn't for malingering and over-reporting. The tendency is for under-reporting of symptoms and impairments, and you don't want to be dismissing the disorder when it's really there. Now, there is one exception to the rule, and that is college students. 1 in 4 college students in the U.S., and also here in Canada, seeking accommodations in the university around exams and other aspects of college life is malingering. So we teach people, if you work in a university counseling center and these college students are coming in, 1 in 4 is faking the disorder to get the Vyvanse, to get the Adderall, to get the Ritalin, to get the Concerta, to get the accommodations, the extra time, and all the other things that, at least in the U.S., university students are eligible for under the Americans with Disabilities Act. So we teach people that there is a very special area where malingering seems to be at its highest, and that is on the college campus. Driving is an area that has been well studied in adult ADHD, probably better than any other domain, believe it or not. We have more research on driving than any other. And when we look at driving, we see that even at operating the vehicle itself, even at this very basic cognitive motor level, we see differences between ADHD and the general population. Poor steering, not able to keep the car in its lane as well as other people. Whether that's inattention or the motor coordination or both, but there is a little bit of veering with the vehicle, and we even pick it up in our simulators. Also, very poor reaction time to critical events that happen around the individual. I had a $100,000 simulator for a while that I was using to assess adults with ADHD, and we were able to pick up all of these very minute differences in just how they maneuver the vehicle. One of the things that was striking that I haven't seen other people talk about so much, but we saw it in our simulator firsthand. We would start to throw critical events. I could sit at a computer and I could start to create hazards around you while you're driving in our simulated Ford Victoria, Crown Victoria. And what we found is that when a critical event happened, the general population slows down and allows the event to play out in front of them so that they can deal with it. The individuals with ADHD were likely to have a critical event, and their reaction was, get the hell out of here. And so they would speed up and drive around it and pass it. Or there'd be a guy coming onto the side ramp, and instead of moving over, slowing down, and waving him in so you can take charge of this situation, they're racing the guy, right? Oh, you think you're getting in here, do you, buddy? On the speedometer, there he goes. And the two of them are fighting to let this guy in on the 401 or whatever your freeway is out here. We would have pedestrians walk out in front of them, and they would veer and go up on the sidewalk. Instead of just braking for a moment and allowing the guy to pass, it was like, I can't be bothered with this. Get out of my way, up on the sidewalk. No wonder that one of my dissertation students, Tracy Richards, showed that road rage is a very common problem in adult ADHD driving. This use of the vehicle to express anger at other people and to coerce other people if you've been frustrated while you're driving. So that's something to keep in mind as well, and it was very much predicted by the emotional dimension of ADHD. In one of our studies, we took our adult drivers out for an hour around the city of Milwaukee with a driving instructor who had a 55-page checklist of driving behavior. Two of them quit. And the rest rated the drivers as being extraordinarily impulsive, and several of them recommended that the people have their licenses revoked. We're not going to do that because it was a research project, but nevertheless, it is palpable, these driving problems. This is not subtle in what we see about the driving in these individuals. And of course, we also found when we interviewed their parents that these children had taken the cars of their parents even before they were licensed to drive. Even at 14, 15, the parents would go out. There'd be a vehicle left there with a set of car keys, and the kids would go joyriding with the vehicle. As a result of all of these problems with driving, people with ADHD have 2 to 3 times the accident rate of other drivers. They have more crashes in their career, and they have more speeding citations as well. And the accidents they have are nearly 3 times as bad in terms of the damage caused and the injuries to other people. So this is not trivial. This is a very severe area of impairment produced by this disorder. So no surprise, over the first 8 years of their driving careers, they had their license suspended 3 times more often than other adults are likely to do. This is unmedicated. In fact, everything I'm telling you is unmedicated. Okay. Yes. Oh, no. We're going to talk about that. Okay. So I want you to appreciate that while driving is a very boring area to discuss in an audience like this, this is a very life-threatening area of adult functioning. Some of our patients are now doing jail time for vehicular homicide because of their killing other people. A case in January in Atlanta is a young 17-year-old girl off her Adderall on the weekend, as some pediatricians are still want to do. By the way, that's out-of-date practice. We don't do drug holidays anymore. But this young lady was off her medication, out joyriding and text messaging while she was driving, and she hit a pedestrian, and she killed him. Now, no court in the U.S. has ever used or allowed ADHD to be used as an excuse for homicide, for for negligence in this case. So she's doing 8 to 10 years now for this particular, and I have other patients in Massachusetts who are doing much the same thing. So I just want you to appreciate that this is a serious area of impairment that needs to be treated. So serious, in fact, that the Canadian Pediatric Association has now recommended that if pediatricians in your country see a teenager whose ADHD is at least of moderate severity, they are compelled to medicate that teenager while they start their driving career. It is something with which I handily agree because, you see, this struck my life. It will be 3 years ago, July the 25th, when at 2 o'clock in the morning, I get a call from the state police in upstate New York in the Adirondack Mountains telling me that my twin brother with ADHD is dead. And he has died in a car accident. And he is off his medication, he had been drinking, he was speeding, he was out joyriding at about 10 o'clock at night on a dirt road in the Adirondack Mountains, a dirt road that can only tolerate about 25 miles an hour. He was only doing 40, and he should have survived the accident. But you see, my brother never wore a seatbelt, and he didn't drive particularly safe. And he was usually highly distracted. He was a musician, and he usually had music playing in the car as well. We don't quite know what happened. What we do know is that as he descended through a turn, he rolled his vehicle, and he was thrown out and crushed. And so I can speak personally to the adverse outcomes that the effect of ADHD can have in people's lives on driving. My brother isn't the only one to die in an accident from their ADHD. A study published just a month ago shows that if you have ADHD, you are 3 times more likely to be dead before you're 43 years of age. So this is a life-threatening disorder, and most of that, at least in the earlier years, is coming through accidental injury. In the later years, it's going to come from 2 other sources. But suffice to say, I very personally now believe that people with ADHD need to be treated when they drive. And I hope you take it seriously as well. You can see here the results of our study at UMass. Once again, the adults with ADHD not only are more likely to experience a driving problem, but to do so much more often. It's the frequency. Everybody has an accident, including a little fender bender, but they don't have as many, and their accidents aren't as severe, and they don't encounter speeding tickets anywhere near the degree that other people do. By the way, parking is another frequent violation. Do you know why? Because you're too impatient to find a parking spot. So you double park a lot. So when you're getting your dry cleaning, when you just want to run in and get a carton of milk or whatever, if there's no spot there, well, you make your own. And then you get ticketed for doing so. So that was the second biggest area other than speeding and associated crashes. Many studies, including my own, have found children with ADHD as they grow up to participate in a variety of antisocial activities. The Satterfield studies were among the first to show this. It's been found in every longitudinal study. Now, I do want to emphasize that most of this activity is predicted by the onset of conduct disorder in the adolescent years, so that ADHD alone is not as likely to predispose to these activities as ADHD is with conduct disorder. But even allowing for that, the subset of kids who go on to become raging delinquents in the community, we did find there was a subset of antisocial activity that ADHD alone was sufficient to predispose to, and that was using drugs, possessing drugs, selling drugs, and stealing to get the drugs or the money they needed for their substance use problems. So while you may think of these as largely victimless crimes, which for the most part they are, there is a set of antisocial activities that ADHD alone does predispose people to. But as far as the violent crimes, the muggings, the rapes, the fire setting, the carrying and using weapons, the bar fights, and so on, it's pretty much determined by whether or not you also had developed conduct disorder when you were young. ADHD alone was not a predictor of these sorts of things. And by the way, it wasn't just in their adolescent or adult years. This is going back below age 12. And you can see here, the black bar is higher than the other bars in terms of frequency with which these individuals were likely, not frequency, but rather the percentage with which they were likely to have engaged in these encounters. Now, this is whether or not you've ever used a particular drug, and of course there's not an awful lot of differences here across these bars, except you see cocaine and LSD. But that's because this is, did you ever once try these things? And even the general population tries some of this stuff. So do people with other psychiatric disorders. It's the frequency that separates the adult with ADHD. So let me tell you the 3 drugs of choice that we found were problematic for most of the adults we saw. Nicotine was number 1. ADHD in adulthood predisposes to nicotine addiction. Why? Because nicotine treats ADHD. In fact, we have 3 drug companies now that are exploring variations of the nicotine molecule as the next wave of drugs for treating ADHD. The problem they're having is that when they split off the part of the molecule that is addictive, it also tends to be the part of the molecule that is also beneficial. So they still have some work to do, but there are drugs in the pipeline that are nicotinic receptor drugs. So we find that when teens with ADHD start smoking for the various reasons people start, whether it's peer influence or to be cool or because some celebrity is doing it, they will rapidly accelerate their reliance on nicotine because they self-medicate. It does treat their disorder, but they're treating their disorder with a highly addictive and carcinogenic drug. But it does work. And so one reason we find that they are predisposed to nicotine use is that it does help them. But alcohol was the second best drug that they were using in terms of its frequency, okay? And alcohol is not a form of self-medication. It does not help ADHD. It actually makes it worse because the initial phase of the biphasic effect of alcohol is disinhibition. So that when you first start drinking, the effect on the brain is disinhibitory. Only when you've consumed enough alcohol does it become sedative, but its initial effects are a releasing effect. You've already got somebody with an inhibition deficit, you can expect to see a lot of disinhibition in the first phase of alcohol use. So we found that mainly the adults with ADHD were drinking for the same reason that other adults were drinking excessively, and that is that alcohol narrows the scope of time. The more you drink, the more you live in the now. And alcohol has this wonderful telescoping effect on our sense of time and the future. So probably the reason they're doing it is to forget. They've had a lot of trouble, they've had some failures, and they start to use alcohol to just block out all of the rest of that life and just kind of live in the moment, here in the bar, peeling the label, off the Bud Light, and kind of enjoying the company. You know, it's a means of forgetting your problems, but it's certainly not self-medication. The third drug of choice, which we believe acts the same way that alcohol does, was marijuana. Adults with ADHD were using marijuana far in excess of other adults. Even if they hadn't developed a dependency or an addiction to it under the DSM rules, they were still using it much more frequently than other people do. Again, probably to help with their coping of their lives, of failures and other problems that they might be experiencing. Now, we were the first study to do complete physical exams on all of our adults with ADHD, including urinalysis and lipid profiles. And what we found in the life course of these individuals was a growing risk for primary care health disorders. And you can see it here across the board. Sleeping problems, difficulties with medications. By the way, medical is the illegal use of prescription drugs. So across the board, their lifestyle and their health risks were becoming increasing concerns to them and to us the older that they were getting. So we found there was an increased risk of accidental injuries, even in adult life, that was producing medical problems for them. We also found that there was a drift toward a more couch potato, leisurely lifestyle, that people with ADHD were more likely to allow visual media to be sources of distraction in their lives, whether it's text messaging or cell phoning or video gaming or watching television. They were more likely to be doing those things than other people do, and they were less likely to be engaged in advanced education, reading for pleasure, self-improvement, exercising, the other things for which we usually believe self-discipline is going to be required. So if you were in primary care and I described that lifestyle to you, there would be things that you might predict as a consequence of that. One of them is obesity, and that's what we found. As we followed our kids into adulthood, and as we studied the adults who came to our clinic, we found that there was a growing risk for increased body mass index and frank obesity. In fact, there are now 3 studies that have found that women with ADHD have a markedly higher rate of bulimia, the impulsive eating disorder. Not anorexia, not the restrictive kind, but the impulsive kind, the binge eating, purging, that is often the case with bulimia. 16 to 22% of adult women with ADHD are bulimics. So there are eating disorders that are associated with this, and whether you're male or female, there is a growing risk of obesity problems in these adults, not with all of them. And by the way, this is the first generation we've seen that. Earlier follow-up studies did not document that, but it may have to do with the availability of fast food over the last 20 to 40 years as becoming more and more ubiquitous in life. The impulsive foods that are there all the time and can be garnered very easily may be contributing to this. It's not clear. We did find that there were more dental problems in our adults, that they were less likely to be engaged in preventive medical and dental care, leading to difficulties. My brother was a classic example of that, allowing his teeth to become so badly decayed that he developed infections and damn near killed himself a few years earlier than he finally did because of sepsis. One of his teeth had become so infected that he had to be treated for a systemic infection that had developed. You can die from infected teeth. So they seem to not take the steps to engage the preventive aspect of medicine, the annual visits to the physician, the 6-month dental cleanings, and so on. Some of this has to do with financial differences. As we found, adults with ADHD weren't earning quite as much money as other adults in our studies. But some of it also has to do with the forethought, the foresightedness that is required in order to use preventive medical and dental care. We found extraordinary money problems among our adults, as you will see here, particularly in these areas. Many of them weren't saving anything for retirement, found it difficult to save at all for anything. Impulse buying with credit cards was a major problem for some of our adults. Having their utilities shut off for non-payments, very common story in the history of the adults that we saw. And then, of course, having their cars repossessed, which you don't see here, was another aspect of these financial problems. So no surprise, when you give impulsive people access to money and credit, you may find that they don't necessarily manage that as responsibly or as well as they should. Finally, as you see down here, we are the first study to document a growing risk for coronary heart disease. ADHD predisposes to CHD, making it a public health problem, not just a public mental health problem. In fact, we also now have data to show that it's going to predispose to cancer if it's not treated because of the increased smoking and drinking and poor nutrition. On top of that, of course, the problems with weight. It's easy to see how those would contribute to risk for coronary heart disease. And even at as young as 27, we are showing that young people with ADHD have a marked increased risk for heart disease, even at this very young age, than do people in the general population. So we have now written in our book that ADHD, if it is left untreated, will probably shorten an individual's life expectancy. We have several studies that attest to that. Let me explain one to you. There's a life course study that was done in California that followed thousands of individuals from birth to death and documented the death by all causes, and found that the single best predictor from childhood onward that beat out all other predictors of life expectancy was childhood impulsiveness. The more impulsive you are as a child, the shorter your life is going to be. Now, they classified impulsive people as falling in the bottom 25% of their population. And they found that it had shortened the life of these individuals by 8 years. That's the lowest 25%. ADHD is the most severe, 5%. So it doesn't take a genius to see that if being in the lowest quartile shortens your life by 8 years, being in the lowest 5% is probably shortening it even more. So we are now arguing that adult ADHD, if left untreated, is a public health issue, not just a mental health issue. We studied the offspring of our adults with ADHD because it's a genetic disorder for the most part, as I explained this morning. And we found what everybody else has found, including the Montreal Children's Hospital study of adult ADHD and all other studies of families with ADHD. 40% of the children that had been born to our adults with ADHD had ADHD themselves. By the way, the next highest disorder besides ADHD was oppositional disorder. Whether the children had ADHD or not, ODD was likely to be there in nearly half of the children born to adults with ADHD. Now, why might that be? Because part of the risk for oppositional disorder is disrupted parenting. Parents who use consequences inconsistently and impulsively, and parents who use high rates of expressed emotion with an individual. And all of those would be predicted if we knew that a parent had adult ADHD. We would expect them to be more impulsive, more emotional, less consistent in the way they manage their children. And so, no surprise, we would see ODD as a correlate of this parenting pattern, not just the genetic risk for ADHD as well. So let me summarize the differences that we found between ADHD and other outpatient disorders. ADHD is more severe in terms of its symptoms and the impact of those symptoms. ADHD is a more chronic disorder and unremitting. Most other outpatient disorders are episodic, including anxiety disorders, depression, and so on. We found that ADHD produced more severe impairments. Whatever domain you looked at, the adults with ADHD were more impaired in that domain than were adults with other disorders. There were more impairments in the adults with ADHD. If you counted up the number of different domains that ADHD interfered with, it was more than in any other group of our outpatient control group. The most adverse effects, as I've already said, were in education, followed by work, followed by social relationships and finances in adult life. Some of the outcomes, as we've explained, are life-threatening. Others are going to have an impact overall on the health and well-being of these individuals. We did find that adults with ADHD turned out to be more responsive to our treatments than were these other disorders. So that adult ADHD is actually a more treatable disorder than our anxiety disorders and depression. But we also found that having adult ADHD and not treating it is very costly to the patient, to their families, to society that has to pick up the costs, these indirect costs. So I didn't go through all of this to depress you. I went through all of this to impress you that this is a very serious disorder. This is not some trivial little fly-by-night disorder. And also to emphasize something that I don't think is emphasized enough, especially by other advocates, ADHD is no gift. There is no evidence in any research on any of hundreds of measures that we have taken that show that ADHD predisposes to anything positive in human life. Now, let's be clear. ADHD is but a small set of the hundreds of psychological abilities that people will have. And many people may be gifted and talented in various aspects of these other human abilities, but never attribute that giftedness or that success to the ADHD itself. There is a profound tendency in the U.S. right now for advocates to roll everything about a patient under the tent of their ADHD and to use it to account for everything. So that Michael Phelps won 8 gold medal Olympics because he was ADHD. And the owner of JetBlue is a successful entrepreneur running an airline because of his ADHD. And Howie Mandel on Deal or No Deal is a successful comic turned game show host because of his ADHD. And Ty Pennington on Extreme Home Makeover is very successful at destroying and rebuilding houses for other charitable purposes because of his ADHD. None of this is true at all. These people are successful because they have other attributes in which they are gifted, but in no way does ADHD predispose to any of the things that I have mentioned. If so, we would have seen it. So I want people to understand that while people may be gifted and talented and successful in spite of their ADHD, it is not because of their ADHD. The ADHD itself may in fact make you less effective than what other people who have equally talented areas in those human abilities. We don't know. Nobody's done that comparison. But it's going to be very hard for society to take you all seriously if you continue to trumpet this disorder as a gift. There is no way that we can go to Ottawa and walk the halls of Parliament arguing for accommodations, entitlements, funding of ADHD medications on the one hand, while rah-rah cheering ADHD as this wonderful giftedness that we have and you don't. They are antithetical to each other, and it doesn't work. And it's a lie. So let's stop deceiving people about this. This is a real disorder. It's a very serious disorder. But it doesn't mean you may not be talented in many other areas of life, and that you can use those areas of talent to compensate for the disadvantages that ADHD may be producing. But success is not attributable to ADHD, not in any of the hundreds of studies that have been done to date. So I'm asking for clarification on this issue. I'm not saying that people can't succeed with this disorder, but it won't be their ADHD that caused that. So what do we need to do? The first thing that we need to do to address these issues is to make sure that adults with ADHD are extraordinarily well informed about the nature of their disorder and the risks that go with it. And so that means reading, learning, going on the internet, and making yourself an expert on the disorder, its causes, its impairments. You've done that merely by attending this weekend. You've gotten a lot of information about these issues. But continue to make yourself an expert so that you stay abreast of the developments in this field. And also of the things that do and don't work. We know things that don't work. We know that dietary manipulation is not very useful. We know that getting your skull massaged by a chiropractor is not useful. That acupuncture is not useful for this disorder at this time. And other such things like sensory integration training and so on. There are many treatments that we can use, and we're going through them in just a moment. But there are things that you should steer clear of, magnetic mattresses being among them. You should adopt a chronic disability perspective for the disorder, very much like diabetes, as I argued this morning, the reasons being very obvious. This is a neurobiological disorder. Now, one of the first things that Kevin Murphy and I have learned to do with our adults is, after going over all of this can be rather depressing, can it not? And so the next thing we do is to try to instill hope in our patients as well. And we do so by explaining to you that you have the most treatable disorder in all of psychiatry. There is no disorder in the mental health profession that has as many treatments, that normalize as many people, that have the highest percentage of responders to treatment, and produces the greatest improvement in symptomatic relief as this disorder. Not one. Not bipolar, not depression, not anxiety, not schizophrenia, not mood disorders, none. Those other disorders wish they had the available treatments that we have in North America for managing this disorder. Our problem is not effective treatment. Our problem is public awareness of this disorder. When only 1 in 10 people get access to care and get treated for the most treatable disorder in psychiatry, that's the problem. But the treatments we have work, and they work for most people, and they work very well. That's not to say that they solve all the problems. So one of the first things that we instill in our people is you need to get treatment because you have a very treatable, manageable disorder. Now, we also find when we meet with our adults with ADHD that this diagnosis and this history of impairments usually brings with it a mild grief response. Sometimes it's not so mild, by the way. Sometimes the anger and the grieving and the depression are quite extreme and require separate counseling sessions in their own right. We have had adults with ADHD become extraordinarily angry about how could earlier professionals have missed this diagnosis, and the regrets they have about the failures that are now irreparable. The marriage is lost, the college degree never attained, the friendships that were lost, the accidents that they had, maybe the injuries. You can't make up for that. Even though you may get diagnosed at 35 or 40 years of age, there's 40 years there of irreparable harms that have mounted up. So it's no surprise that some of our adults are angry or depressed about not having been treated earlier when it might have made a difference in changing their life course. So we will spend some time with these adults, speaking with them about these feelings and helping them unearth them and cope with them, but moving them on to the end stage of a grief reaction, which is acceptance. So that's where we want you, because you won't engage treatment if you haven't aggrieved and accepted your disorder. Now, we also, as I've said, want our adults with ADHD to understand what is attributable to ADHD and what may be due to other disorders. Over 80% of adults with ADHD have a second disorder, and over 55% have a third disorder. So the most common pattern is for adults with ADHD to have 3 disorders. And all of them are going to need to be treated, because treating the ADHD won't get rid of the other 2. By the way, the other 2 that are most common, apart from the learning disabilities that had to do with school, are anxiety and dysthymia, which is a mild form of major depression. The risk for depression is there, but it's really more anxiety disorders. In fact, we were the first longitudinal study to show that the longer your ADHD went untreated, the greater the likelihood it was going to link up with an anxiety disorder over time. We also want the partners, the spouses, the family members of adults with ADHD to learn about the disorder, to understand its neurobiological underpinning. in order to do, if only one thing, and that is to remove ADHD from the realm of moral judgment. Because that is how most relatives and family members view this undiagnosed patient, as a character flaw, as a personality deficit, and as a moral failing. You could be different if you wanted to be. It's merely a choice that you're making. And we need relatives and partners and spouses to understand this is no choice. This is this disorder. And in doing so, we hope to pull it under the realm of the medical and mental health sciences, and therefore under the realm of compassion and a willingness to assist the adult with ADHD, as opposed to the realm of judgment. Now, there are many medications that are out there to help ADHD. I'll describe the ones in the U.S. You have most, though not all of these. Certainly, the stimulants remain drugs of choice for most ADHD adults, though the non-stimulants can also be quite beneficial for subsets of adults with ADHD. The developments, as I explained yesterday, in our field over the last decade have been in delivery systems. We don't have new stimulants. What we have is new ways of keeping these medicines in the bloodstream for hours longer than was originally the case with the immediate release pills that were on the market. So now what do we have available? We have the pump, Concerta, which is a little miniature pump that squeezes out liquid Ritalin for about 8 to 10 hours after you swallow it. How cool is that? That is a neat little osmotic pump. We have the time-release pellet system. This is Adderall XR and Focalin XR and the other time-release forms, the pellet system. These are little time-release pellets, and some dissolve now, some in an hour, some in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 across the day. By the way, there was a slight difference between the two delivery systems in when they reach their peak. So if you encounter problems more in the morning hours, the pellet system is a little bit better. It's releasing more medication in those earlier hours. If you experience more problems in the afternoon toward the early evening hours, the Concerta pump system seems to be a little better because it's releasing more of its agent late into that afternoon day. But across the day, both are pretty good, and both delivery systems last about 8 to 10 hours. The next development was the skin patch, which I don't believe you have, and this is Daytrana. This is methylphenidate in a patch that you can wear on a hip or a shoulder, and you absorb your drug through the skin. And the only thing you have to remember is to take the damn thing off, because you won't go to sleep if you don't. So the patch needs to be removed several hours before the anticipated bedtime. But the nice thing about the patch is you can make it last as long as you want. It isn't like the other pellet and pump systems. It doesn't have a built-in time decay in it. So if you happen to need to stay up a little later at night or need to be driving for a longer purpose into the evening hours, you just keep the patch on for longer hours. Maybe at some point you'll get the patch up here. I don't know. But we have it available in the U.S. It's also good for kids who can't swallow pills. Finally, last August was invented a brand new category of drug. And it is called a prodrug. And this is Vyvanse. Vyvanse is an amphetamine. But it's a non-abusable amphetamine, which eliminates one of the biggest social concerns we have about these drugs, was their abuse liability. And this drug cannot be abused. And you have to understand the structure of the drug to understand why. Because what a little company over in Albany, New York did was to take amphetamine and lock it up with a chemical called lysine and bonded them together. And what does that do? It means the amphetamine cannot be activated. Now, when you swallow this tablet of Vyvanse, what's going to happen is there's an enzyme in your intestine, and especially in your bloodstream, that is going to strip off the lysine. And that leaves the amphetamine to be activated. So this is an amphetamine that can only be activated in the human gut and bloodstream, and nowhere else. Not in your nose. You can't snort it. You can't crush it. You can't inhale it like cocaine. It only activates in the gut and when it's absorbed through the intestinal lining into the blood. And then the amphetamine activates. So this eliminates one of the criticisms of amphetamine, that they have abuse liability. This one doesn't. The neat thing about this, only discovered after Shire bought the rights to this drug from the small biotech company, is that this lasts for 2 hours longer than the other delivery systems. This is about a 12-hour delivery system. There are some advantages to Vyvanse, and I expect you'll have this drug up here within a year or so, over Adderall. Adderall is the competing drug, and it's manufactured by the same company, Shire. But the advantage to Vyvanse is it's much softer in its onset and its offset during the day. Whereas Vyvanse has Adderall has a very rapid onset. People can feel it. In fact, some people get TMJ. They're clenching their teeth. And they have this tension that comes with the rapid onset of an amphetamine. So there may be some differences in side effect profiles with that drug. The next drug we have is the first drug actually that was approved in the US for adult ADHD, and that's Strattera. Strattera is not an amphetamine. It's not a stimulant. It's not classified as an abusable drug. It's a norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor. Now, the advantage to Strattera is it can be used in instances where stimulants may actually worsen people's comorbidities, anxiety, tics, OCD, insomnia, and other difficulties that stimulants may have the potential to worsen. Strattera does not worsen those problems. In fact, Strattera is a very effective anti-anxiety drug, as effective as any other drug we use for anxiety management. So one advantage it might have in the subset of patients who have anxiety is that it might manage both disorders. The disadvantage to Strattera is that it takes 3 to 4 weeks to titrate it up. You have to use it very gradually, because if you take it up too quickly, people get sedated and nauseous. And to avoid that happening, you have to adjust it very slowly. So that's a disadvantage, because if you need to treat the disorder yesterday, the stimulants are a much better option. But if you have time and you can be patient, Strattera is a very good drug. The second disadvantage is that it doesn't work quite as effectively in terms of the degree of improvement you get is a little bit less than what you would get with a stimulant. It still works for 3/4 of the people who take it, but the degree of change is not quite as much. The upside, however, is that we don't see as much emotional blunting as we saw with the stimulants. About 1 in 5 children, and even some adults, report to us that their emotions are quelled by the stimulants, that they seem to have a very blunted range of emotion or affect. And they don't like that feeling. And parents often refer to their children as sort of robot-like automatons. And Strattera doesn't seem to have that disadvantage. This hasn't been studied. These are just clinical reports. So there's another drug here that might be of advantageous for some types of ADHD with certain comorbidities. Now, lately, we've been studying the antihypertensive drugs, which are clonidine and guanfacine. And although they're often used to treat high blood pressure, they do have positive benefits for ADHD as well. And so Shire has now been able to develop and will market this August in the US an extended release form of guanfacine, and it will be called Intuniv. So we're going to have an antihypertensive drug on the approved list for treating children and adults with ADHD. And then, of course, we often argue that people should be started on the long-acting forms of these medicines right at the start to try to cover as much of the waking day as possible. And usually we find that even then they have to be supplemented with some of the immediate release drugs. So if you're taking Concerta or you're taking Adderall and you're only getting 8 or 9 hours out of that, but you've got a 16-hour day, we may recommend that an immediate release form of methylphenidate or amphetamine also be prescribed and used to fill that gap in time where you can't take a second form of the sustained release, not and get any sleep anyway. Ultimately, it's been our experience that unlike child ADHD, we're more likely to need to use several medications with adults with ADHD. And that is because the adults have high rates of comorbid disorders, anxiety and depression among them. These are not responsive to ADHD drugs. So medicating a person for ADHD doesn't touch their anxiety disorder, nor does it help their depression, unless, of course, you're using another drug to manage those, or in the case of Strattera, which does have some anti-anxiety properties. Now, there are other treatments that have been developed in the last 2 years in the States that are psychosocial. We now know that contrary to what we learned about childhood ADHD, adults with ADHD do respond to cognitive behavioral therapy. And so now there are 2 treatment manuals on the market based on research that's been done at Harvard Med School and at the University of Pennsylvania by Safran and Ramsey, respectively. And you can find these at the adhdwarehouse.com or just by searching Amazon, and you will find that there are treatment manuals for working with adults. But you need to understand that in all of this research, the cognitive behavioral training around executive functioning, because that's what they target, is executive functioning, the working memory and the other deficits I spoke about this morning. that these are supplements to medication, that the patient needs to be on medication to benefit from the cognitive behavioral training, that if they're not on medication, they're highly unlikely to be responsive, much less to show up for their appointment. One of the best things that we have found adults can do, in addition to going through these cognitive training programs, getting on medication, is to find other people in life that you can use to make yourself accountable to each day for the work or the goals or the other things that you have promised that you are going to get done or that you're trying to accomplish that day. Whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the college environment, whether it's in your marriage or elsewhere, you are much more likely to adhere and complete a task if you commit to doing it in front of others and make yourself accountable to them for meeting with them several times a day in order to see how you're doing in meeting those goals. The coaching network was in fact developed to fill this gap, where if you don't have other people, significant others in your life, you can go to the coachingnetwork.com or other resources and link up with the people who are willing to do this kind of accountability, for a fee, of course, but nevertheless they are available. And Heidi, I don't know if you're in the room and whether CADAC or CADRA link up with these coaching systems or not, but certainly I'm sure a search of the web would find them here in Canada quite easily. The next thing we need to do with adults with ADHD is to help them down-regulate their reliance on legal and illegal substances. Whether this is putting them through smoking cessation programs, which, by the way, they are not likely to respond to if they are not medicated for their ADHD. We have now found that you've got to treat the self-regulation disorder before they can benefit from these detox programs. So that is what we try to do, whether it's with a stimulant, whether it's with atomoxetine, but they need to be on medication before you try to detox off of these other drugs. Obviously, getting assistance with time management and organization. If you live near a major metropolitan area, which clearly the Toronto area is, you will find in the yellow pages people who specialize in professional organization and time management. And we have linked our adult clinics up with these individuals where we teach them about adult ADHD, and they accept our referrals of people who want to go and have an expert come out and reorganize your office, your job, your work life, your house, whatever it may take in order for the flow of work to be better suited to the ADHD part of your life. These are people who, with appropriate training, can be quite useful in advising you on how to make your life better organized and your time management more successful. Now, with young people, we have found it necessary to reevaluate them for ADHD-friendly occupations, because some occupations are not real friendly to adult ADHD. Others may have started out being friendly, and then you get promoted. And the promotion brings with it a greater responsibility, and with that, we see a greater impairment. An example was a young man that we were working with a computer company in Massachusetts, who was Salesman of the Year for New England for this computer company. Loved it, out all the time, driving around New England, meeting with customers, making sales. Had a great organized OCD secretary to follow up on the paperwork. Just did wonderfully, making a ton of money on commission. So good they promoted him. He became district sales manager. Do you know what a district sales manager does? He sits in an office all day long and tracks the sales of the agents in the field. And he could not stay in that office. So they're ready to fire him. So we said, you can either be medicated for your ADHD, and maybe you might be able to make it in this job, or you might just ask for a transfer back to the field. Better you have a job and be successful than have no job at all. And so sometimes we not only reassess the job, we ask you to maybe take a shift in the nature of the job to make it a little bit more ADHD friendly for that individual. Obviously, in the U.S., we have laws now, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that require that your employer make reasonable accommodations for your disorder. You cannot be fired if there has been no reasonable accommodation made. If there has been one and you're still not doing the job, you can be fired. But the word is reasonable. Right? Now, the other side of that coin is you have to tell your employer that you have the disorder and prove it with documentation. A lot of times that goes very well. Many employers are sensitive and compassionate and wish not to be sued. Others, however, will take this the wrong way, and they don't want you here anymore. And so they will go through any hoops they need to document your failures and to make superficial adjustments that they declare as reasonable. But their ultimate goal is to fire you. So we do not tell adults with ADHD to go running down the hallways of all of their employers' places, screaming about their ADHD and how wonderful it is, because in some instances that comes back to bite you. It requires some careful forethought, discussion with a professional, understanding the nature of that workplace, maybe doing a little research about previous accommodations that that employer has or has not made before one actually discloses the ADHD. Now, for our adults with ADHD who are living with other people, cohabiting, or married, we often find that some short-term marriage counseling or relationship counseling is in order. Gina Paris spoke about this, I believe, here yesterday. If she didn't, she has one of the best books published just a month ago on this aspect of adult ADHD. It's called Is It You, Me, or Adult ADHD? And it is a book for spouses, partners, others who must live with the adult with ADHD, and how to readjust your relationship and your home life to accommodate the adult with ADHD. It's an extraordinarily well-written book. I highly recommend it to you.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Can I interrupt? Gina Pierre is presenting this afternoon.
Oh.
We just found out this morning, last night, she won 4 book awards for that book.
Thank you, Heidi. Hey, how great is that? Okay. Wonderful. Well, see? Yeah, she's here, right on site. But some counseling, in addition to just reading a self-help book, is usually necessary, partly for information, partly to teach the partner or spouse about ADHD, and also to handle any other issues, because some of the issues are not ADHD related. I mean, let's face it, some of us can be jerks in our marriages, and being a jerk has nothing to do with being ADHD, and we're going to have to deal with our jerkiness with our partners. So that needs to be dealt with as well, along with the other comorbidities. Now, time doesn't permit me to go through each and every recommendation. I wanted you to have these in your handout. So the next 3 or 4 slides are simply a list of common sense adjustments, changes to the workplace, changes to the school, changes to the relationship, or to your home life that you may find helpful in adapting to the executive deficits that we have spoken about. So I just wanted you to take these with you, because we're just not going to go over these, and nor is there a need to, because these are quite, I think, self-explanatory. What I would like to do, however, is to draw your attention very quickly to what do you do if you're a parent with ADHD and you're in the role of child care. And we're now realizing that your ADHD poses risks, not just for you, but for your offspring as well. So here on these 2 slides are just some suggestions for what you might want to think about as adjustments that can be made to your parenting in order to compensate for your own ADHD. And that includes letting the non-ADHD parent deal with time-sensitive issues such as schoolwork and meetings and doctor's appointments with your child, where you will be less likely to keep those appointments. Making sure that the non-ADHD adult is consulted before you engage in punishment of your children, to make sure that you have bounced off what you're about to do on someone who may be less emotional than you tend to be in your use of punishment with your children. And to make sure that if you are driving your children anywhere and you have ADHD, you are medicated while you are driving, or you allow the non-medicated partner to chaperone or chauffeur, that is, your children around to these various places. So, to conclude, as we've said, adult ADHD is a serious disorder. It's one of the more impairing outpatient disorders of which we are aware. There is no domain of adult life that this disorder may not have an adverse effect upon. But in contrast to all of that, it is the most treatable psychiatric disorder that we know of. So let me stop there, and I'll take a few questions, and then I know my car is here because they've just called me on my phone. It does. So does all alcohol exposure. Alcohol is one of the top 3 toxins that a woman can consume during a pregnancy that creates an added risk for ADHD. In fact, if you drink any amount during your pregnancy, your risk is going to go up about 3 times that of what it would have been otherwise. The more you drink, the more you are malforming the frontal cortex of the affected fetus or baby, and that's going to lead to a high risk for ADHD. ADHD is very high among fetal alcohol syndrome babies, but doesn't have to be full syndrome. It's exposure. It's a dose-response relationship. The more alcohol consumed, the greater the risk that something detrimental is happening. Tobacco smoke is even worse. 10 cigarettes a day or more appears to be the threshold. If you're smoking a half a pack or more during your pregnancy, you are increasing the risk of ADHD in the offspring by that act alone. So there are these toxins that do lead to this. Yeah. Yes, that is separate from inherited ADHD, and as I said at the beginning of this talk this morning, the acquired type, including the fetal alcohol type, is probably not quite as responsive to the medications as the genetic type of ADHD is going to be. And that's already been established in some studies of FAS kids. Okay. Life consequences, what some people call natural consequences, what used to be called the Dreiker's approach to management, which is allowing nature to take its course and people would learn more from these natural events than they would from artificially arranged events, is a disaster for this disorder. Absolute disaster. And that is because the most salient consequences are delayed consequences. And a delayed consequence is no consequence if you have this disorder. And so we tell people, absolutely not. If a principal tells you that your child needs to fail in high school in order to wake up, smell the coffee, and get it right, find another high school or educate this principal about the true nature of this disorder. That is a ridiculous recommendation. I mean, that's like saying that someone needs to be hurt in a car accident and then they'll wise up and drive safely. Not going to happen. So we need to make sure that artificial consequences are injected into these gaps in time where these natural consequences accumulate in order to, as we said, increase the accountability, to tighten up the consequences so that they don't drift toward these more heinous, more severe natural delayed consequences, whether it's school failure or grade retention or injuring somebody with a car or dying yourself in an accident or these other longer-term adversities that we've spoken about here. The management of ADHD is the arrangement of artificial devices and prosthetic accommodations to prevent secondary harm. It is precisely the same rationale for the management of diabetes. Managing diabetes does not cure diabetes. What it does is to prevent all of the other things that are going to happen to you if your diabetes isn't managed every day. And those are appropriate reasons in their own right to manage a disorder, even if the management is not curative of the disorder. It is the prevention of secondary harm. So no, natural consequences are not good consequences. They're often too little, too late, and sometimes irreparable. Great question. This is now being investigated, particularly at Yale, but also in Detroit at the Wayne State Medical School. I want you to, first of all, let's take the normal population. When we hit our late 50s to early 60s, everybody, men and women, will start to see a decline in the executive system, chiefly in the working memory aspects, not so much in the inhibitory aspects. But there will be a decline in working memory capacity. Now, women, it's a steeper, earlier decline because of hormonal influences on the frontal lobe. For some reason, this frontal cortex seems to be exquisitely sensitive to these hormones. And so alterations in the availability of these hormones seems to create a greater deficit in women than men. But both will suffer as a result of this. Now, that's the average general normal population is going to start complaining of forgetfulness, inattentiveness, unable to follow through, not remembering why you entered a room, what you're supposed to be doing. We're all going through that right now. But imagine if you had ADHD and now you hit 55 to 60. You don't have the same neural reserves that the general population has. You're already symptomatic before you get to 55. It's going to get worse, markedly worse. So consequently, we are seeing a rise in referrals of people in this age group asking if they have ADHD. Now, some of them are just going through normal aging, but what we're finding is some of them had subclinical ADHD for which they were able to sort of compensate until they hit their late 50s, and now they can't compensate anymore. And now they're becoming fully symptomatically raging ADHD in the later parts of their careers. So that at least is what we're seeing clinically. There is not a single published study yet on this issue, but grants have been funded based on this rationale that I just gave you, that if you already have an executive deficit and you hit the point where even normal individuals are losing working memory, you're in trouble. So I think that's going to happen. I am part of the DSM-5 work group, yes, but there are multiple levels of these committees. Each committee is charged with a certain aspect of the DSM-5. My work with DSM-5 has already been done, and that was to identify the issues, review the available research, answer the questions that could be answered, and then defer to data sets that were out there to try to address some of the new questions. And now the committee has been reformed with other people on the committee to give other people a chance to be involved in this as well. There is also an effort on the part of the American Psychiatric Association that as the work moves up to these higher level committees, that those people on those committees have very limited or no ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And as you saw, I do. So I will not be involved at those higher level decision making. I happen to disagree with that decision, but I fully understand why the APA wants to retain an arm's length distance from big pharma, because they've been criticized so far for being involved with pharmaceutical companies. So am I involved? Yes. Will I be involved in the future? Probably no further. Well, I've written whole chapters on this subject, so I just don't have the time in a minute or two to go into all of the nuances and details. I will direct you to the second chapter of my adult ADHD book is a review of how we made the diagnoses of people coming into this research project and all of the issues that one needs to take into consideration. Or Michael Gordon and Kevin Murphy wrote a chapter on assessment of adult ADHD in my Handbook for Diagnosis and Treatment. It's a 2006 third edition. There's a beautiful chapter in there on the details of assessing adult ADHD. I would direct you to at least those two sources in order for you to walk through this, because although it's not rocket science, it does require a certain amount of information to make the diagnosis appropriately. Now, the DSM-5 committee has been informed of the results of our research and others showing that there was a better list of symptoms for detecting the adult stage of the disorder than the DSM-4 symptoms. The DSM-4 was designed for children. It was never tested with adults. And what we learned over the years is that it misses a third of all adult ADHD. And so we spent 7 years under an NIMH grant testing 91 new symptoms for adults to find out which were the best. And it turned out there were 9. And those are in my adult ADHD book. I can send them to anybody who would like to have them. And we are teaching clinicians that in addition to the DSM-4, you need to be reviewing these 9 symptoms because they are better than the DSM-4 is at picking up the adult stage of this disorder. So to put it in a nutshell, you need to be using rating scales as a quick screen. If a person passes the screen on a rating scale for this disorder, they need to be seen for about a 3-hour interview where we're going to go over history, life course, impairments, efforts to make accommodations for their ADHD, detecting comorbidity. It takes about 3 hours to do a careful evaluation. Then we're also going to get the paper trail, the school records if available, whether or not your mom saved your report cards, your driving records, your criminal records. We're going to be reviewing all of this as a means of establishing how impaired you are from this disorder. And then, of course, we're going to go over your strengths as well, because we may need to call upon those to compensate for your ADHD. And usually at that point, combined with expert knowledge of differential diagnosis, how is ADHD different from bipolar and borderline, then you reach a diagnosis. But I just don't have time to go into all of the details of that. Please check out those resources.